got any questions or concerns or would like additional clarifications on any terms that are mentioned throughout this presentation, do utilise the chat box and we'll aim to have those questions answered at the end of this session. Next slide. In the spirit of reconciliation, the ECCV acknowledges traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connection to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Next slide. So, for the workshop content, I will go through a little background on ECCV and the Community Outreach Project, and Taniola will discuss some common tenancy challenges we've come across during our time as community outreach workers. There will be information on rental support services also available. We will then have a comprehensive presentation from Ben Cording, who's our guest speaker on rental laws and changes, so stay tuned. Ben will be providing an overview of the 130 new changes to the Residential Tenancies Act and what this transition from COVID-19 renters protection now looks like. Taniola will also be presenting case studies to Ben, who will provide informative responses, and then finally we'll have a Q&A session at the end. Next slide. So a little about ECCV. The Ethnic Communities Council of Victoria is a member and Victorian Representative Council of the Federation of Ethnic Communities Councils of Australia, VECA. We are the voices of multicultural Victoria, strengthening and building our community through advocacy and leadership, empowering people from culturally diverse backgrounds. Our vision is to help build a culturally diverse and harmonious society that is just, fair and inclusive for all Victorians. Next slide. The Community Outreach Project. As community outreach project workers, we provide tailored place-based supports to the specific needs of culturally and linguistically diverse communities impacted by COVID-19. We've worked on the ground and in local communities to engage directly with people from cold backgrounds who have faced a range of challenges because of the pandemic. Some of those challenges relate to mental health, education and employment. However, many tenants and renters have also faced extreme financial difficulties. Therefore, the purpose of this session is to help members of the CALD communities understand their legal rights and responsibilities according to Victoria's rental laws and regulations. I will now pass the microphone to Taniola.
Thank you, Val, for taking us through that introduction. I will be taking us through the common challenges that community members face. We will discuss these challenges now, and later on, Ben will expand on what the law states on many of these issues. In the course of our work as community outreach workers, we noticed three major challenges. The first challenge is around repairs and maintenance. We've had community members who have complained about being unable to carry out repairs in their homes, and some of them have also complained about the reluctance of their landlords in carrying out those repairs. And please stay tuned to find out what the law states as what is called an urgent repair and a non-urgent repair, and what you can do to get your landlord to fix things in your rented home. And the second challenge is around reduction of fixed-term contracts. And during COVID-19, a lot of people faced financial difficulties and wanted to reduce their fixed rent contracts. We believe financial difficulties can happen at any time in our lives. It is not only restricted to the pandemic. And so later on, we will be discussing how you can reduce your fixed rent contracts when you're faced with financial difficulties. And the third challenge is around compensation for tenants. We've had cases where many landlords have breached the terms of their contracts, and many community members were unaware that they may be able to receive compensation if their landlord breaches the terms of their contracts. And so later on, Ben will be expanding on many of these things as we bring out the case studies. Next slide, please. So during our time as community outreach workers, we came across a lot of multiple support organizations, and we have also worked with many of them. Tenant Victoria is one of such, and many of these, some of these support organizations include Tenancy Victoria, Unequal Legal, Consumer Affairs, Tenancy Plus, Tenancy Assistance and Advocacy Program, Justice Connect, Victoria Legal Aid, Vacate, Disaster Legal Help Victoria, among others. Right now, I will hand over back to Azal, who is going to introduce Farah. Thank you.
Thank you, Taniola. I will now like to give the floor to Farah Farouk, who's the Director of Community Engagement, who will also introduce Ben from Tenants Victoria. Welcome, Farah.
Hi, thanks, Azal and Teniola. It's such a pleasure to be here with ECCB. We have at Tenancy Victoria considered our engagement with Australians from multicultural backgrounds as a key priority as we move into a new phase of our engagement. And we saw in the pandemic how clear communication, not just in English, but in other languages, is so key to engagement. And it's something that we will continue to be working on. And we so appreciate this partnership and your invitation to present to your group today. As mentioned, I'm the Director of Community Engagement at Tenancy Victoria, and I myself am from a diverse background, which gives me a pretty good lens into the challenges that many of our fellow communities face. And it's not just me. Across the organisation, there's a deep recognition of these realities. And I'm so happy to introduce to you today my colleague Ben Cording, who works in my team and is lead lawyer for community legal education. And Ben he's been talked about as the walking, talking encyclopedia on residential tenancy law. And I'm happy to lend our walking, talking encyclopedia to you for this session. He's been with Tenancy Victoria for 7 years as a principal lawyer, which means he's deeply steeped in the law. And he's been spending the past year learning about the new rental reforms and also contributing to the reform process through policy work, as well as direct contact with clients. So he's perfectly poised to share his wisdom with you today. I have great pleasure in introducing my colleague, and please let's continue to talk. And can I encourage everyone from ethnic communities to come on to our helpful website, where we will be developing more language resources over time. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, shall I start then?
Sure.
All right, thanks, Azal, Teniola, and Farah. Look, we look like we're a small group today, but that by no means doesn't mean that we're not important. And a large amount of the work that we do is around connecting with people, sharing our stories, what happens, and how people can change their situation. There are a lot of people that are really, really stressed through this time. Understanding the law is helpful. It's a start. A lot of tenants are scared, and that means, well, what do you do when you're scared? You've got to be brave. And that's actually one of the hardest parts of the job, is encouraging people to participate and go through a system that's really not something they've done before, and it can be scary, and we need to work out how do we best support people through it. So I'm happy to take any questions that people have got. If there's any words that I use that are legal jargon or not familiar to you, that's fine, just let me know. It's all about everyone having an understanding. I still ask people, what does that mean? That's totally fine. All right, so just sit with these slides. They're not a substitute for legal advice, so jump on our website, have a look at information. But if you do need advice, we do provide advice directly to the community. It is hard to get through to us. There's a lot of demand, but certainly you're welcome to give us a call. And if you are representing an organisation, you can actually call through to our admin line directly. And you can get through to a lawyer much, much quicker. So if you're assisting a tenant and you're from an organisation, don't call the main advice line, call our administration line, which you'll see down there, the 94111444, and you'll be able to speak to a lawyer almost immediately. And that's much, much quicker if you're representing other people or other tenants. All right, next slide, please. Cool. So today what we're going to run through is just a really big overview of the laws. There's a lot of changes. Probably the biggest one, which we won't cover much today, is about eviction, which is actually, they have this new thing called a reasonable and proportionate test. It used to be that if a rental provider could prove why they want the property back, you'd almost always get kicked out. Whereas now they actually can sort of look at the situation and your story and what will happen for you as a person or your family, and actually ask the question, is it reasonable that this whole family get evicted? So it's a little bit more open to VCAT to actually say, well, maybe this family shouldn't be evicted, or maybe this person shouldn't be evicted. So we'll look a little bit of an overview. We'll look at the minimum standards. They're new. They're things that should be in every rental property where it's what's described as a residential rental agreement. It used to be called a tenancy. They're the same thing. Then we'll do the case studies, and then we'll do some Q&A. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so as has been mentioned by Azal and Teniola, as of Monday, all these new laws have started. Some of them and most of them will be immediately effective. Some of them are only relevant to when you actually start a new tenancy. So there's a whole bunch of new protections. And obviously very, very important is that now in all tenancies, they have a attachment which talks about discrimination, which is really, really great for everyone to know about what discrimination is. So what are the protected grounds? And how do we make sure that if discrimination is occurring, how do we make sure that that doesn't take place? What can you do? So you can actually even seek compensation if you've been discriminated against now under the Residential Tenancies Act. So there's what's called the Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission, if you haven't heard of them, and they run a free conciliation service. And it's a really, really important service if you've never heard about it before, and that can cover things like employment and all sorts of areas of law where discrimination may happen. We know that discrimination happens. We know that it's real. It is hard to prove sometimes, particularly at the time of applying, but certainly well worth being aware of those changes in the Act, and that'll now be attached to every new residential tenancy agreement, and hopefully that'll help the community understand A, that this is what discrimination is, and B, it's not okay, and C, what you can do about it. So there's some of the changes that we'll talk to you about. Consumer Affairs has linked a whole bunch of new information. One of the main changes is that during the COVID period, there was anything that related to rent arrears would have to go through a discussion first before it got to a formal proceeding. It was called the RTDRS. There was also a rent relief grant where people could get up to $3,000. So both of those COVID protections have ended, and also people being protected for rent arrears because of COVID hardship, what they call hardship, they weren't able to be evicted. That's now ended. So that means that now we expect to see for a lot of people many more notices to vacate for rent arrears, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll go through sort of an overview fairly quickly of 20 of the major changes, and then we'll get sort of into a little bit of the minimum standards and the case studies. So one of the first things is that tenants are no longer called tenants, they're called renters, and landlords will be called residential providers. They're the same thing, so don't be confused by the change in language. It's okay if you use one accidentally and the other, but it's just symbolic of changing from, someone that rules over people to a consumer contract, like when you buy, a phone, or, when you buy any other sort of product, it's a consumer, you're a consumer of a service. But obviously it's important in recognizing that it's your home. The other thing which is really important for the community to know is there used to be this thing called a no reason notice to vacate, where they could kick you out and not have to explain why they're evicting you. That's gone, which is really, really important. So when we talk about, Azal and Teniola going out and doing outreach, a lot of people go, I've got repairs, but I'm too scared to ask for the repairs because I'm scared they'll kick me out. And they would often use that no reason notice to vacate. They still have an end of fixed term notice, which only applies for the first contract, the fixed term period, but you can always challenge them if it's retaliatory. So what does that mean? Retaliatory is where they're doing it out of spite, or they're grumpy at you. So I might ask for my oven to be fixed, and then a week later I get this end of fixed term tenancy, and I go, why are they trying to kick me out? It's clearly because I wanted the oven or the repairs or the mold or whatever it is fixed. So you can actually still challenge those notices as well. So that's good news for people to be more confident about asking for repairs. There's a new notice to vacate for threat and intimidation. So you do have to be careful, getting grumpy at someone. If, there are good landlords and there are bad landlords or rental providers, but you do need to be careful about any threat or intimidation if you get angry. But if you do get that notice, as with any notice to vacate, you don't have to leave on the termination date. So in the form, it'll say you must be out by the 1st of April or the 1st of whatever date. You don't have to leave. If you don't leave, it forces the rental provider to go to this place called Vacate. So Vacate, if people haven't heard of it, it's like a court, but it's much more informal. There's no legal fees, regardless of whether you win or lose the matter. People often represent themselves, but you can have a representative or a support person along with you. And there's no guarantee that the rental provider will actually be successful in trying to evict you. So if you get a notice to vacate, it's a really good idea to seek advice. Start off with the website to see what's there. All right, reduce notices of intention to vacate. That's where you're wanting to leave the property, generally when you're in a fixed term contract. That's a 14-day notice that you can give in certain circumstances. One of them might be that you're offered community housing or social housing. And there's a whole bunch of other reasons now that people can more easily get out of their lease agreement. So again, if that happens, good idea to seek advice and check the website. There's some new duties about the landlord particularly. One of the main ones which we'll talk about is the landlord's got a duty to ensure the property is in good repair. There's also some safety activities required. So if you go to the next slide, we'll have a look at that. So safety activities, they now have to do gas and electrical checks for new agreements every 2 years. So that means that they've got to go through all of the appliances. And in about 2 years' time as well, you'll see in the minimum standards, they also need to have safety switches, which is really important. So a safety switch is if I shove a knife in an electrical socket, it'll automatically shut the power off so I can't get electrocuted. So that's really, really important as a step, and that's one of the minimum standards. Termination before getting the property. So you might start off into a lease and then turn up and go, oh, wow, this is not at all in good condition like I thought or I was told it was. There are circumstances where you can end the lease and not get liable for what they call lease breaking, which is the income until they find a new tenant in a lot of situations. And so one of the grounds, if they don't meet the minimum standards, is that someone can end the lease if they haven't moved in. So that's new as well. Bond recovery is new. We'll run through that a little bit in one of the case studies, but roughly speaking, no one should ever be able to take your bond unless you have agreed to it or unless Vacate has given an order. So again, Vacate would be able to decide that. So pretty much any tenancy dispute is heard by this body called Vacate, Victorian Civil Administrative Tribunal. Okay, then lease breaking, we'll deal with that in one of the case studies, and that's now more regulated, which means it tells us more specifically what's involved when someone decides to leave their lease early. So you might have promised to stay from 1 July 2021 until 1 July 2022, and if you leave early, you may have some liability, or you may have to pay the rental provider some money, and we're trying to reduce what you have to pay. All right, next slide, please. Okay, mandatory disclosure obligations. So this is really useful for a lot of people. They have to tell you if there's been a homicide there in the last 5 years. So if someone's been killed there, if there's asbestos that's like all crumbly, it's called friable asbestos. And also if there's any building permits. So if you move in, you might find there's a massive building going to be put next door and you're going to have to put up with all this noise. So they now have to disclose a lot of that information. So that's really, really good. And that's before you sign the contract. There are prohibited questions now. You can see there at item 12, and that means that they can't ask about, well, have you had a bond fight, like a fight over your bond before? Or they might want to go off, show me all your bank transactions, show me your financial records and everything that you buy. You can now actually remove all those transactions and just show what your income is. So that's protecting your personal information a lot better. So there's a whole range of prohibited questions that they can ask. And if they're going to ask any of your what are called protected attributes, so that's, race, religion, ethnicity, work affiliations, a number of things. They can't ask those without providing a written reason of why they need that information to decide. So essentially, again, it's trying to prevent discrimination. There's a free payment method now, so you've got to be allowed to use Centrepay. Centrepay is where Centrelink allows you to take out the money directly before you actually get the money in your account, so your rent's always going to be paid. It's really useful for people that have got addictions that are not good at managing their money, but they have to choose to do it unless there's what's called state trustees involved, so someone else sort of controlling the money. And they also have to allow you to use electronic transfer. So that's, again, hopefully helpful for receipts. If you ever pay cash, make sure you get a receipt. A lot of people will ask for cash. Be very, very careful paying cash. Avoid paying cash where you can. Rent increases are only every 12 months now, and they need to show you the method. We don't know what method means at this point. There's fixed price advertising, so there shouldn't be any ad saying, hey, rent my place, and no dollar value telling how much it is. So whenever you rent a place, make sure you take a screenshot either on your phone or save the web page on your computer. Ads can actually be really important in terms of clarifying the terms of the agreement. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, every renter on the lease now gets a set of keys. So for those that like the movie The Matrix, lots of keys, we need lots of keys. So that's really useful for people because sometimes keys can be expensive to get. So nice and simple. Modifications, there's now a huge ability for renters to ask their rental provider and say, can I get this? And if they say no, you used to not be able to do anything. Whereas now you can actually go to Vacate if you need to and say, this is what I'm wanting. I might want a baby gate put in that I have to drill into the wall. There are also modifications where you don't even need consent. The important thing is that if you change a property, you will generally be responsible for restoring it back to its original condition, unless you reach an agreement with your rental provider. So just because you can put a hole in the wall doesn't mean it's going to be free. So you do need to be careful still with making modifications. Really good tip for anyone moving in or out of a rental property: photos. Take photos, make sure they're backed up in the cloud. So that means like on iCloud or Google Photo or some sort of app service, so you don't lose those photos, because if you lose those photos, you're really at a disadvantage when it comes to the bond and things like that. Rights of entry. So this is when the rental provider can give you a notice saying, I need to come into your home for these reasons. There's only limited reasons, and they need to give you a certain amount of time of notice saying, look, in a week, I'm going to come and do a general inspection to look around the property. There now are open inspections, which is where they can bring large numbers of people through, only twice per week, and for not longer than an hour. And if it's for sale or for showing a prospective buyer, someone that's interested in buying the property, you actually get compensated now. So you either get $30 a day or half of the daily rent for every entry that happens. So that's a good thing, but it's pretty invasive. So just be aware that is a change in the law that some people might be upset by, but that's something that's there. Discrimination was spoken about already, about the importance of the notification. It's also in other contexts, so around disability modifications. So people that have disabilities, the Equal Opportunity Act has always been there, but it's now easier and more recognised to protect people making modifications in a home, due to needs of their body and mind and whatever else it might be. Urgent repairs has increased. So a renter can actually get up to $2,500 worth of work done if it's an urgent repair, not a non-urgent repair, but an urgent repair. And the urgent repair definition has been extended to include pest, mold, air conditioning, minimum standards, safety devices. So that's really useful. The other change in the repair framework is you used to have to get a report from Consumer Affairs, which, all up could take about 60 days. Now you don't have to get that. You can still ask for it if you want, but you don't have to get that, which means that your hearings can be much, much quicker in terms of getting repairs if you can't reach an agreement amongst yourselves. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk a bit about the minimum standards just quickly. The minimum standards are new. They will not apply to every agreement immediately. There's a bit of confusion on Consumer Affairs Victoria website. They're a regulator, so they're one of the ones that sort of try to help give everyone information. They can also take action against someone that breaks the law. So if they commit what's called an offence, Consumer Affairs are the ones that you would report it. So if you get a really nasty landlord, or if you get something really bad that's happened, you can dob them into Consumer Affairs Victoria. With the minimum standards, as I said, if they don't meet the minimum standards, you can actually treat that as being an urgent repair. So that's one of the things that's listed as an urgent repair. And if they don't meet the minimum standards and you say, look, this is not up to scratch, and you want to end the lease before you move in, you can also look at doing that. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so what are the actual minimum standards? So they're probably things that will exist in a lot of tenancies, but some of them they don't. That's why they're minimum standards. There's locks, vermin-proof bins, a toilet that's properly connected to the right sort of sewerage. So that's sort of all regulated and there's nothing bad going on with the toilets. Bathroom, kitchen and laundry, if there's facilities for laundry, and they all need to have reasonable supply of hot and cold water. So we don't know what that exactly means at the moment, but that's a good argument. If you move into a big property and it's got this tiny little hot water service and you've got a family of 8, then that's not going to be sufficient. So that's useful. The property has to be structurally sound and weatherproof, so you should never have a leaking roof. You shouldn't have massive cracks in the wall where you can fit your hand in or anything like that. Next slide, please. It's got to be mold free. So we know mold is a really big issue in a lot of older properties. Electrical safety switches. So an RCD is a safety switch. That's what they call that, an RCD sometimes. Window coverings, they've actually got another year to do that. But if there's a room, like for bedroom or a living room, they need to have blinds and curtains on them, but that won't come into effect for about a year. The windows have to be open and closed, and they have to have a latch. So if you get a window that's got like a nail through it, stopping it from opening and closing, that's not in good repair. You could treat that as being a repair issue. Lighting, they've got to have enough lighting. Ventilation, it's got this big fancy building code standard, but it really talks about sufficient ventilation for the use of the room. So if you think that room's really stuffy, you can maybe get Consumer Affairs to investigate and see what they think. And then lastly, heating. So all the lounge rooms need to have a heater in it. There's a what's called a transition window. So if you've got a place and it's already got a heater in it in the lounge, that'll probably be good enough. But in 2 years' time, all the heaters need to be at least a 2-star rating. It's an energy efficiency rating. If there's no heater in there and the minimum standards apply, then you can actually apply for them to get a heater, and it has to be energy efficient straight away when they get the new one. So any water, gas, or electrical appliance that's replaced now has to meet minimum efficiency standards, and that's hopefully good for the environment, but also good for people's utility bills. If people don't know, there are things called URGs, URGS, so that's utility relief grants, which some people may be eligible for. So if you haven't heard of URGs, they can get up to $600 off per utility every 2 years. It may not be applicable for everyone. If you've got any complaints about utilities, particularly with the utility provider, there's another organisation called the Energy and Water Ombudsman Victoria, and they can help you negotiate if you're not getting payment plans or if you're finding utility company being very difficult to deal with. Not so much the landlord though. Next slide, please. Okay, so heaters, I think we've discussed that, and then we'll jump on to the next bit. Okay, so mandatory disclosure. So the property needs to, they need to disclose if it meets the minimum standards. They also need to disclose if it meets the gas safety and electrical checks. And if there's any recommendation, so if an electrician or a gas person has said, look, it's okay, but this needs to be done, they need to disclose that when someone goes into the lease. So disclosure just means tell you about it up front. Yeah. Next slide, please. Okay, so in the condition report, you'll find, so the condition report is something that goes with the lease, and it tells you this is what the property looks like. Just with condition reports, you'll often see the rental provider has written everything's in good condition, and the renter's going, no, it's not. It's not in good condition. It's okay for someone to disagree and write their opinion on the other side. So don't expect that condition reports will agree. Again, the best thing you can do is just take really extensive photos. So you can check that there about when the smoke alarms, the electrical and gas checks were last done. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so the duties there to make sure those checks are done, that's in section 68. It'll apply to new leases there, and there's regulations around the safety check. So we expect that the full safety check framework will be in place in 2 years. All right, next slide. Okay, all right, so let's have a look at the case studies that Azal and Teniola had sort of sent through to us. So we've got Freya, she's in her mid-30s. She recently lost her job and she's facing financial hardship. She just broke up with her partner. She was with them for 5 years, and she wants to end the fixed term lease, and they're both on the lease agreement. She's told her landlord, who will now be called a rental provider, that she can't meet the rent payments anymore, and she wants to end the fixed term. So she's in an agreement and there's some liability there. And her landlord said, no, not letting you out. What can she do? This is a pretty common issue, and it may vary depending on if the person lives in social housing or if they live in private housing. It looks like this is probably private housing. In social housing, which is director of housing or community housing, a lot of people will want to stay, but they'll want their partner off the lease when they break up. That's a bit more of a complicated issue. So the partner in this situation, let's assume the partner's also wanting to end and leave. If there is domestic violence there, which can happen as well, people don't always, upfront say, hey, look, we've broke up and there's been some violence going on. You do need to ask about that. It's not something that any of us should be shy about asking. It is endemic, and there are deaths that occur every day as a result of family violence. So we need to not be shy about it, both talking and engaging perpetrators, who are people too, and victim survivors as well. So it's a difficult issue. All right, so next slide. Let's see what we can do to help Freya in this situation. There's really three main options available to Freya. The first one is probably the easiest if everyone's cooperating and they just want to end the lease, but it is hard to do. It's called assignment. It's a legal word for it, but it means to transfer the lease to someone else. So if Freya and her partner said, look, we've broken up, let's get someone else to take over the lease. And they might know someone in their community that goes, yeah, I'd love that property. I'll take it over. The law says that the rental provider can't unreasonably refuse to take that person. So if they go, here's my income slips, I can pay the rent, don't have any tenancy database listing issue, then you can actually force a rental provider to take it, but you do need the written consent. We find that a lot of people find this difficult as an option, but it's the cheapest and most efficient way of doing it if you've got someone available. The next option is called a reduction of fixed term tenancy. This exists in the old framework and it carries over into the new laws as well. And essentially you need to show that there's been an unforeseen event, that event causes you hardship, and that your hardship would be greater than that of the rental providers or the landlords. So in cases of just relationship breakups, you'll often get it. The tribunal can sometimes give you some compensation, but it should be less than your normal lease breaking costs. The most important thing about applying for a reduction of fixed term tenancy is you must hold on to the keys. If you give the keys back, that actually ends the tenancy, which means there's nothing to reduce. The tribunal goes, you already ended it when you gave the keys back. The challenge with this option is that you might have to wait about 3, maybe even 4 weeks before your hearing comes up, particularly as we expect post-COVID. VCAT will be very, very busy. And if you've got those keys for 4 weeks, that's 4 weeks liability of rent where you're potentially living there. I mean, you could move out and just hold on to those keys. People often do that. What we don't know is actually sort of a bit related to the third option. The third option is they give as much notice as they can. So she might say, I want to leave straight away. And they both leave straight away. But if she says, well, like, actually, I want to leave in a month, then that gives them a month to advertise the property and start bringing people through. And that is something that then she can try and defend her lease breaking costs. So when we talk about lease breaking, it's made of 3 things. It's advertising costs, which are about $200 or $300 usually. Reletting fees, and that's a fee the rental provider, so the landlord, pays to the estate agent to bring people through and all that sort of stuff, and that's again probably about sort of $200 or $300, and both of them are pro rata. What does pro rata mean? Pro rata means that if you're, say, for example, in a 12-month tenancy and you're 9 months through the tenancy and there's only 3 months left, that's 1/4. So you're only liable for 25% of those fees. So if it was, this is just for math's sake, not what the numbers would be, $400 for advertising and $400 for reletting, your liability would be 1/4 of each of them, so a total of $200. So what we can do now is that she gives as much notice and says, look, I'm going to move out in a month. She then moves out in a month. The rental provider maybe leases the property 1 or 2 weeks after that. The rental provider will then try and make a claim against Freya to VCAT. And she can actually defend it and say, well, did you advertise it straight away? No, you didn't. Or, you know, you can make arguments about it. Or I put my friend forward and you refused to take them as another tenant. They have an obligation to what's called mitigate, or to take steps to reduce what their own losses are. And we know now under the new laws that VCAT can also consider Freya's hardship. So is it COVID related? Is it the relationship broke up? Is there domestic violence in place? So if that's the case, the tribunal now, which they previously couldn't, can consider Freya's story. So if you're a support worker, it's really important to understand the full story of why someone's leaving that property. And that acts as what we call a mitigating defense, or something that will not completely mean you don't pay anything, but it will reduce the amount that you pay. Okay, next one, please. So that's Freya. Next one is a repairs issue. So we've got Matthew here. So Matthew lives in a 2-bedroom apartment with his family. Before he moves in, he realizes the alarm system's faulty, and the landlord says, yeah, I'll fix it in the week. And of course, doesn't. Lived there for 3 months, despite emails and calls, not fixed. Okay, so is this an urgent or non-urgent repair? That's the first thing we need to work out. Next slide, please. So there's a definition in the legislation. So when we say the RTA, that's the Residential Tenancy Act 1997. Make sure you look at the Victorian one, because there are other ones that are the same year. You can find it on a website called AUSTLI, AUSTLII. There'll be links in the slides as well. You'll be able to click to find it too. And one of the things that's included in the list of urgent repairs, noting that it now includes pests, mold, and the minimum standards and safety devices as well, is anything that renders the property unsafe or insecure. So does the safety alarm system do that? Yes, it probably does. So in this situation, it would probably be an urgent repair. So what Matthew could do, if we just go on to the next slide, Matthew could apply. So if you can't, he's tried to email, he's called, and he's just not getting anywhere, he can go to Vacate. If he's on a healthcare card, he can ask for a fee waiver, which means it won't cost any money, it'll be free. If he needs to pay an application fee, the fee is only $65.30 or somewhere around there. So it's relatively inexpensive. And you can also ask to recover that fee in your application, because you shouldn't have to go through Vacate to get something like this fixed. Under the law, Vacate has to list this within 2 business days. So it's really, really quick. It's always heartbreaking for me to see a family go without a hot shower for 9 months and go, you could have been into Vacate in like 2 days. So it is confronting. And as I said, it's important that people understand that they are better protected than they have been previously from that threat of eviction. Vacate does about 50,000 cases a year. So this is a very common issue, whether it's a hot shower or an alarm system, whatever it might be. So he takes some evidence. It might be a photo or a video. Here's me using the alarm system. At the moment, Vacate hearings are all being done on the phone. So that means, you know, you might need to send the video through on an email to Vacate so they can see the video, and you send it to the other side as well. With the Vacate application, we can help people guide through that. And there is some really good information on the Vacate website about how to use those forms. If at a Vacate hearing, English is not the person's first language, interpreters are provided for free. So someone should always know what's going on in their hearing. And if there's anything that's, you know, feels like it's technical, Vacate, the members will help explain things. Just tell them, look, I'm not understanding everything. And they will usually give you a bit of an explanation. Even sometimes I go, what's going on? But generally, it's pretty straightforward. Here's the alarm system. Here's my video. The member who's like the judge, you can call them a member or they'll tell you how to talk to them. They will just go, yep, it's not working. And they'll make what's called an order, a bit of paper saying, landlord, you must fix it by this date. And with compensation, you've actually got up to 6 years to make a claim. So you can either ask the tribunal and say, can I make a compensation claim now and what they call amend or change my application to include compensation? Or you can actually claim that after someone's left. A lot of people don't feel comfortable claiming compensation while they live there. You can do that. If they want to claim compensation while they're living in the property, they need to give this form called a breach of duty notice, essentially saying, I want this much money. So whenever the property is not in good repair, you should never pay full rent and not be getting the full benefit of that property. So if you've got a broken oven, it might be 2% of your daily rent, and you've got to work out how long was that broken for, and that will work out roughly how much your claim is worth. There's no science to it. It's very approximate. And the tribunal will say, yep, I think that's probably on right. I'm going to reduce it a little bit, or maybe I actually don't think that the landlord's at fault here. And whether, as I said, if you go to Vacate, whether you win or lose, there's no real consequences outside of that, which is why sometimes we see outrageous claims by rental providers, because they know there's really no consequence for making a big claim. It's pretty intimidating for a renter. So look, people should try and work it out if they can, but if they can't, Vacate is there, and it is a fairly supportive framework. So as I said, renters can choose to pay $2,500 themselves and get reimbursed. We don't suggest you do. Go and get the order. It's a lot easier to do that than chase money. Yeah, so that's pretty much a bit of repairs and compensation. With anything that's a repair issue, so it's not in good working order, it will be a non-urgent repair. So if it doesn't fall into the definition of urgent repairs, it will be by definition non-urgent. And then the process is slightly different. In this case, if Marthy wanted to go through non-urgent repairs, he could actually use his emails and say, here's my emails. As long as 14 days had passed, he could try and attach them to a Vacate application. And instead of applying under section 73, he would apply under section 75. So when we talk about the section numbers, they actually just go in boxes of the application. They are important, but if you don't get the section numbers, that's okay, as long as people can work out exactly what you're wanting. So I want urgent repairs, I want non-urgent repairs, and this is what I want done. That's probably enough to get it going. Doesn't have to be perfect. All right, next one, please. All right, so we'll look a little bit at bonds, just briefly. Let's check how we're doing for time. So bonds have changed a little bit. So let's look at Mal's situation. So Mal lives in a studio apartment and he's got a pet called Rocky. She completed her tenancy and has moved out. and she wants her bond back in full, and the rental provider essentially says, no, I think that this is damage. I think there's been damage here. And Mal's saying, well, actually, I think it's not damage. I think it's what we call fair wear and tear. So what's fair wear and tear? Fair wear and tear is just a quality loss, or it doesn't look as good, or it doesn't function as well from just using it the normal way. So that's what's fair. It's just the normal usage of it. Okay, so the rental provider says, no, not giving your bond back. This is probably one of the biggest misstatements and misrepresentations made by some rental providers or agents. The rental provider doesn't have the bond. All bonds, every single bond, has to be lodged with what's called the RTBA. The RTBA is the Residential Tenancy Bond Authority. So what happens is all the bonds go into that account. Now, the bond can only be released one of two ways. Either you agree in a form or through an agreement of some form at Vacate, or the rental provider has to prove their case. They have to prove their case to the tribunal, to Vacate, and you get the opportunity to attend. So either the rental provider can apply to Vacate, or the renter can actually apply to Vacate and say, I know we're going to have a fight about this. I don't like it, but I know that I'm not going to get anywhere with the agent. So you can actually apply, and it puts pressure on the rental provider to explain what they do. In the new laws, a renter can actually apply directly to the RTBA and say, I want my bond back. And there's a clock starts, a 14-day clock, 14-day sort of running clock starts. And it essentially says, rental provider, unless you apply to Vacate and explain why the renter should lose any part of their bond, I'm going to release the money back to the renter automatically. And so that puts pressure on rental providers to put in an application, and for someone to be able to challenge the rental provider of how much they're trying to get out of that bond. All right, next slide, please. So as I said, there's a number of ways. So you can try to negotiate with the rental provider and reach an agreement and just go, look, I can't be bothered with this. It's $200. Let's do it half. I'll pay 100. I'll give you 100. You give me the rest of my bond back. You can reach an agreement and you can lodge that through the RTBA, and it's all done. But if you don't want to do that, and you don't have to do that, and you think, wow, this is outrageous, they're making a huge claim over my whole bond, and I don't think that there's any good reason for it, then you can go to Vacate. And again, that's okay. And the burden, the person that has to prove their case is a rental provider. Even if the person is found to be at fault, just jump onto the next slide, please. Even if the person is found to be at fault, you can actually still defend it. So you can argue that it's fair wear and tear. That carpet is not damaged. It's just old and it's sun stained, or, it's threadbare because it's older. If you find out, for example, the carpet's older than 10 years, you can use what are called the tax office depreciation rates. They are a table that tells you how long things last. So carpet, for example, lasts 10 years. So if you know that carpet is 15 years old, its value has gone down to zero. It's no longer got any value there. So I think it's important that people are able to realize that you can defend things, even though you might be at fault. You may not be necessarily liable for the whole amount of money because it may be really old. So it's important for people to check out our website about ways of reducing claims and defending claims. And as I said, the biggest challenge that we see, or I've seen in my time, is that people are just afraid of this idea of Vacate. So it's certainly well worth, taking your photos and go, here's the carpet at the beginning, here's the carpet at the end. And at the end of the day, the Vacate member will decide that. You can't be listed on a tenancy database just for going to Vacate. You can only be listed on a tenancy database if you lose more than your bond, and if you don't pay whatever's owed after 3 months. So there's definitely some protections there. And part of, I guess, what I see our role is encouraging people to use those services. I know a lot of people don't like the formal side of it, but there are videos that show you what it's like to go to Vacate, and at the moment, people are appearing on the phone. So that hopefully makes it a little bit easier as well. All right, just next slide there. Okay, so that's just the idea of the tax depreciation records. You can see that there, and pro rata valuing. You can click that link actually in the slides if they're provided, and you can see what sort of things have got value and how long they're expected to last. And if the landlord's not successful in proving their claim, that money will be directed back to you as a renter, which is great. And that's how it should be. It's presumed to be your money. So no rental provider can just say, I'm going to take your bond. If the bond is not lodged, it's an offence, and you can dob that into Consumer Affairs Victoria. So as soon as you go, hey, I paid $2,000 and it didn't get lodged, call Consumer Affairs and say, I've got a bond that's not lodged, and they'll sort it out for you. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so that's the case studies. Really happy to take any questions that people have got. If there's anything, it doesn't have to be on those slides. It can be anything about the reforms generally. Yeah, whatever is going to be helpful for you, your community, the people you work with.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ben, for that. We'll now go to the question and answer session. Does anyone have any question? Can we check the chat? If you have any question, you can put it in the chat section.
What's the definition of unfit for human habitation? Yolanda's asked. Yeah, look, really great question. There is not a legislative definition, so I can't look it up in an act and say this is what unfit means. But there is what we call case law. So case law are where there are decisions from other disputes in the past, and then they use them and other members say, yep, that's what we think it is. So a definition of unfit for human habitation, I think, would essentially mean that it is unsafe to live in the premises and there's a real risk of harm. So, sometimes we see, okay, there's, it might be a minor crack in the wall and you go, oh, is that unfit habitation? And then other times you might see a crack that's this big or a crack that's this big. So it is a scale, and it will depend on, so we've seen houses that have had the toilet erupt. And so, you've got effluent or wheeze and poos all throughout the house, and you go, yeah, that's not safe to live in. That's unfit. Sometimes local councils can be helpful with structural things. So structural things can be hard to challenge. Where there's been a fire, so you might have that there's been a fire in the premise, you go, well, actually, part of the house is livable, but that part is not. What we often suggest people do is that if you're really unsure, you can apply to Vacate to say, well, you tell me, is it unfit for habitation? But you don't usually want to be waiting 2 or 3 weeks for that decision. So there's a bit of a risk. We can only express our opinion to say, yes, in our opinion, it looks like it would be really risky for you to live there. And if they're successful, then that operates as a defense against lease break. Whereas what we see sometimes is people go, oh, I've had 4 cockroaches in that room. It's not safe for me to live here. It's unhygienic. And then they leave and the tribunal goes, yeah, that's not enough. Unfortunately, you're going to have to pay lease breaking costs. So there's a scale in that. It's usually good, again, to seek an opinion, but no one's really going to give you a definitive answer. What Vacate does have is that they actually do have a list of cases on particular issues. One of them being, here's an example of unfit for habitation where there's, an exposed electrical wire and no safety switch in the house. So yeah, it will definitely be dependent on the circumstances. But I think that there's a real risk of harm is probably a good threshold starting point. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. We also have another question. So thanks for that. How to put in a pet application if you want to foster dogs? Rental provider argues that if it's adopting one permanent dog, it's okay, but not to foster different dogs temporarily.
Sure. So with pets, the law's been with us for a little while. There's a form that you get off the Consumer Affairs of Victoria website, and the form is specific to each pet. So you might actually say, well, this is, Fluffy. Fluffy is a Staffy, Staffordshire Terrier, or I don't know, dog thrower, a Staffy, so fairly bulky dog. And they say, no, I don't think so. You can either choose and say, well, maybe I'll look at a different dog. But if you really want that dog, you can apply to Vacate. Oh, sorry, actually, you put the form in. It's what we call a reverse onus. And the rental provider actually has to apply to Vacate and justify why you can't have that particular Staffy. So the consent is per animal. So if you get 1 or 2 animals, you also need to be mindful that local councils will have requirements. So you usually only allowed 2 dogs, I think, the most, that need to be registered. If you want more than that, I think you need special permits. Depends on the local council. But that process has been actually quite successful. So there's 2 decisions that have been published by Vacate where the rental provider said, nope, I can't have a dog. I'm allergic to fleas or I'm allergic to fur. And the tribunal went, yeah, that's not actually going to cut it, those sort of excuses. And they were successful in getting that pet. So the pet framework is working quite well. So you fill in the form, you give it to your rental provider. if they don't apply or they don't object to VCAT within 14 days, the consent is inferred or given. If they do apply, you've got to see what VCAT decides. And then there's sort of, everyone says, well, this is what the animal's like, this is how they behave. And, you know, if they wee on the rug, you run that a risk. It's a bit the same as having children, you know, that you assume risks, but that's okay. That's why the laws are so important. It's about making sure people can have that as a home. So you do need to be wise about getting an animal, and make sure you've got the time to do toilet training, because that can be diabolical otherwise. Yeah, so do your research, but certainly we've found a lot of people have really benefited from having animals for their families or for themselves if they're living on their own. But yeah, definitely make sure you use a proper form, and make sure you keep a record of sending that form and when you've sent it. So sometimes email or registered post can be really useful. Yeah. Does that answer that question? Yeah.
That's the question. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so Rami's just asked, fear of escalation fear from escalating the landlord. Language is a barrier. Let me just see the rest of that chat if I can. Sorry. Language is a barrier because the landlord may evict them, given a hard time, urgent repairs. So look, overcoming fear for people, I think this is why it's such an important thing for community. Like if you're representative of a community or an organization, is to know what that process is yourself. You can actually go and, like when COVID goes away and the hearings are open again, you can actually go in and sit in the back of any hearing and watch them happen. They are open. If you go through something and you're successful, that story goes to other people and says, well, this is what happened. The options of a rental provider now to kick you out are much harder. So they used to be able to say, oh, I'm going to sell the property. And it was really, really hard to prove whether or not they were going to do it. Now with a lot of the notices to vacate, which is the first step of asking someone to leave, they actually have to provide certain evidence, like, you know, here's my contract that I'm selling the property. So it is much harder for them to do it. Some rental providers are really heinous. If they get really in your face or they start getting aggressive, you can get what's called a restraining order, which is simply, you stay away from me, you only talk to me in writing, and that way everything becomes much more accountable. We don't actually see that too often. Sometimes we see rental providers that will get frustrated, and often the frustration can come through the agent as well. Like they're not, you know, the agent isn't telling the landlord or the rental provider exactly what's going on. So it's really up to people how gently they want to go in terms of, you know, I've asked you, I'm going to ask you again. Other times, I mean, you know, we often go, look, you either negotiate it locally, meaning talking directly with them. And if you can't do that, your other option is to go to VCAT. And look, if you want to be, you know, smooth things over, and I don't recommend everyone does this, but you can say, look, I'm not even interested in the compensation. I just want it fixed. You know, so it's about sort of being clear of exactly what you want to happen. And you can try and say, look, I'm not causing trouble, but this is important for my family. This is important for me. It's about identifying what does that actual issue mean? So when you don't have hot water, you know, and you've got a newborn, what does that really mean? So it's really about making sure people understand where you're coming from. And if you do get someone that's, you know, just going, I don't care, well, VCAT probably is the place to do that. We see VCAT get really grumpy at some rental providers because they shouldn't be in business. They shouldn't be providing houses and family homes when they're not prepared to meet the requirements. So there are offences that they can be met with. So if an outreach worker regularly sees an agent that's really bad or a rental provider that's really bad, dob them in. You know, it may not go anywhere, but it's a good start. And if you've got 4 or 5 people from the same community saying this person is just egregious and, you know, doesn't do anything, you'll find that Consumer Affairs is more interested in where it's a rogue operator, you know, just not doing their job. So they can be prosecuted. It's not common, but certainly that's a good start for people. So I don't know if yeah, the other side is unfortunately, people need to be brave. They need to go through it and see what it's like. If it's the forms that are intimidating, like I said, they don't have to be perfect. You know, in fact, if you're really, really struggling, particularly with the language, you could probably call up VCAT registry and say, look, I can't get anyone to help me with the form. Can I make an oral application? It's not common, but it can be done. You know, the registry will just go, right, sounds like an urgent repair. Do you want me to fill that in for an urgent repair? So the section numbers, as I said, are not meant to be intimidating. It's just about making sure everyone knows what's going on. So if you do an application and don't provide enough detail, the VCAT might adjourn the hearing, meaning just give parties more time to talk, to work out what's going on, to try and resolve it. What we find is that a lot of people, when they apply to VCAT, things resolve magically by agreement, because they know that that member or the person deciding the matter will tell them what they need to do anyway. Whereas if you're just sitting there going, please fix it, please fix it, please fix it, and you're not getting anywhere, nothing happens. There's no accountability beyond that. So that's why even making the VCAT application and saying, I've made the VCAT application, I'm happy to adjourn it, meaning that you can say, let's delay when we have our formal hearing, but let's work this out. Let's work this out, and then I'll withdraw it if I'm happy that everything's resolved. So that's a really important technique, and it comes from people being brave enough and knowing where to find the damn application, which is on the VCAT website. So I can give you guys some information, you know, to distribute as you see fit. But as I said, it doesn't have to be legally fancy technical stuff. You know, my shower is broken, I want it fixed. You know, that's probably enough to work out what to do with it, or at least get it started.
And thank you for that, Ben. We're really restricted with time. Well, one last question. That's the final one we'll be taking. What if it's the agent that's not doing their job? Can we report them? If you can quickly answer that.
Yep, sure. So with the agents, it's really hard. There is regulation around, you know, they're meant to act honestly and fairly and promptly and all those sort of things, but it doesn't really go anywhere. The most effective thing is to look at the particular issue and get it into VCAT. So you can tell Consumer Affairs, and they can do what they call what's Frontline Resolution, which means Consumer Affairs officer will call them up and say, hey, look, I've got some complaints. This is what's going on. Usually it'll be around repairs specifically, and they'll try and broker it. But if they don't get anywhere, then you need to look at going through that VCAT process. So when we talk about them not doing their job, there are things where they might mislead. So we see a lot of misleading happening, particularly, I think, in cold groups. So, you know, people where language is a disadvantage, and they might take advantage of people in terms of, you know, not understanding what their rights are. So again, it's always good to seek your own advice. But if you bust an agent, particularly in an email where you've got some writing, that's really good stuff to dob in. In terms of not doing their job, you want to sort of measure, well, what's going to be the consequence in terms of the relationship? Like, unfortunately, there's no solution to that. But if there's a real problem and they've done something wrong, like they said, oh, no, you don't have any other options, you have to break your lease. And in fact, you know, you could be a family violence victim and there are really clear options available. They're the sort of things that CAV will definitely jump on. But I think for pragmatic purposes, to help people resolve their situations, you're usually looking at VCAT, trying to get into VCAT. So that's really the number one hurdle. You know, of all the hearings, like the 50,000, tenants and renters don't apply much, and they also don't appear much. They get really scared. So that's our biggest thing, is to make sure we know the process well enough that we can be comfortable. For some people that have seen Judge Judy on TV, like the American show Judge Judy, I tell people it's kind of like that, you know, that you just get, you know, on both sides and everyone talks it out, and it might get a little bit wild and crazy sometime, but it's not formal, like everyone sitting up and anyone wearing wigs. It's, you know, it's your opportunity to have your say. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Ben. That brings us to the end of today's workshop, and that's the final workshop for the Community Outreach Workshop Series. I would like to thank everybody for taking out their time to come here. We especially want to thank members of Tenant Victoria, Ben and Farah and Harlan and others. We really want to say thank you. And we also thank every member of the community that has taken time to come from this presentation, and members of the community outreach team at ECCV. On that note, we would like to say have a very wonderful day, and bye-bye.